what I want to know first is, have we been here before in our history? In the past, have political movements blamed immigrants for crime in America?
Yeah, I think thank you first of all for having me here and
My
for taking
pleasure.
taking on this important set of issues.
It is important. You're right.
Yeah, and I feel like you're right. We are in a moment where there is sort of pretty vocal anti-immigrant animus, and a lot of the conversation in those anti-immigrant spheres turns on notions of criminality, right? That immigrants are prone to commit crimes, and you're exactly right to say that we've been here before,
We
and
have.
so many times.
Oh boy.
This is not new in U.S. history, and I think it's really useful to think about the ways that although there's this narrative that we have about being a nation of immigrants and being sort of inclusive and
Yeah,
open,
yeah.
we've definitely gone through many periods in our history, in fact, maybe more often than not, where we are instead sending unwelcoming signals, and where incoming immigrants are treated harshly, and where they're surrounded by a rhetoric of criminality. So we saw this in the late 19th century with Chinese exclusion. The narrative around Chinese immigrants was that they were criminals, that they were sex workers, drug users, unable to assimilate, and so we saw that narrative of undesirability.
Does the term Chinese exclusion, does that term come from a certain act? Does it have a definition?
Yeah. So in the 1880s, Congress enacted a federal law called the Chinese Exclusion Act, and
Oh,
that's
wow.
what it was. It was a law that barred the immigration of Chinese people, and it not only barred them, but then it also it included some measures to ensure that people who were here, who were Chinese, if they didn't have the right papers, could be deported. So this is kind of an early example
Yeah.
of the federal government sort of targeting an immigrant group on the basis of race, trumping up narratives about their unassimilability, about their criminality, and then using federal law in order to target them. And in fact, what we know of that time, you'll remember this was the era of the gold rush. This was the era of some, in the 1880s
Great
of economic
railroads.
collapse, right? And there was definitely hostility, economic tensions between white people moving west, and Chinese workers, and so what was really sort of friction around jobs and the economy and concerns about sort of economic displacement got sort of translated into this story of Chinese immigrant criminality, and then first, California enacted or tried to enact laws and provisions that would limit immigration. It was kind of popular in the West. And then Congress got on board, and you had a federal law that was in place for decades that barred Chinese immigration. So that's an early example of the federal government getting involved, sort of using that narrative. And then we saw it again in the 1920s, sort of very expansively. The 1920s was a period. Expansively in the sense that Chinese exclusion was still in place, and had sort of expanded over time to a sort of pan-Asian exclusion. So pretty much nobody from most countries in Asia were able to immigrate at that time. And then in the 1920s, we saw attention turn to immigrant groups from Europe that some in the United States saw as undesirable. And so we saw the enactment of a quota system.
What do you mean by Europe? Immigrants from Europe? Are we talking all of Europe, or are there?
No, we're talking selectively. So,
such as
really focusing on Southern Europeans, on Jewish immigrants. So there was a real.
And Southern Europeans are predominantly Catholic, right?
So they're Catholic, and they were viewed as culturally other. So Italians, people from Spain, people from Portugal, right? Seen as culturally other, seen as undesirable. And the way that that got translated again was this narrative of their criminality, their unassimilability, their undesirability. and we saw sort of this rising tide of eugenics really in the 1920s, right? This notion that there were some races, and that was constructed as sort of white Northern European races that were desirable, superior, and then there were
In
other
America.
races in America. Yes, this is a rising sort of tide of eugenics in America in the 20s, and then other races were sort of bringing them down, right? So we saw kind of increasing hostility toward Italian immigration, Southern European immigration, but also toward Mexican migration. You saw there for the first time in the 1920s the criminalization of illegal entry and felony reentry on the southern border, right? And that was targeting Mexican migration. And the idea was these people are coming and they're watering down our superior racial stock. And so you see those laws heating up at the same time that you see many anti-miscegenation laws that prohibit interracial marriage, also heating up, and
Wow.
being strengthened and being enforced more rigorously across states, particularly in the South. So it was really a sort of movement about racial purity, a eugenics movement about racial purity that gets translated into rhetoric about undesirability and criminality, and then gets given the force of law, right, in the form of, in the 1920s, a quota system. And the quota system basically said, we're going to favor immigrants who are already overrepresented in the population. So that will favor people who are immigrating from Britain. It'll favor people immigrating from Northern Europe. It will disfavor people immigrating from Southern Europe. And of course, conveniently, although there were plenty of people who had been forcibly brought from Africa, and there's substantial Black representation in the
Yeah.
United States, they're left out of the quota system completely, right? They're not treated as having these familial ties or as part of the counting system when it comes to the quotas.
I hope this is not off topic, and I'm speaking somewhat from memory. In the 1920s, correct me if I'm wrong, there was this, was it a study? Was it a congressional body that got together? The Dillingham Commission?
Yeah. So yeah. So that was part of the response to growing concerns about migration. As you know, there was a real substantial expansion in migrants coming from Europe in this period. So you
Mhm.
see a sort of a historic level of immigration, kind of a historical level that we still haven't really met ever again in terms of the ratio of immigrants versus people who were already here. And so that really caused a lot of unease, cultural unease, economic displacement and unrest. And so there was this commission put together under Teddy Roosevelt's administration to study this question of whether immigration was good or bad for the country.
Did crime play a part in that?
Yeah, and that was part of the notion, right? That there were gangs, that some people were more prone to criminality, that some people were more dangerous inherently, and you can see in that sort of framing the way that eugenics is already playing a role, right?
So
The
dangerous
notion that
inherently, both because they're immigrants and because they're of certain ethnicity or race. Did I
correct.
say that correctly?
Yeah, so these are linked notions, right? It's not
Yeah.
just that they're coming in, but that certain kinds of people are coming in that have been racialized, right? That there's a notion that these people are inferior, and so the Dillingham Commission, it sets about to study the question. They wrote a multi-volume report that makes a series of findings that
Was it a
become the
diverse commission or were they all white men?
it's largely white people.
Yeah.
It is interestingly a lot of women were employed by the Dillingham Commission, so
Oh,
there is
interesting.
there is gender diversity
Well, good
here
for
of the
them.
people
At
who
least that's a positive, right?
right. So there's lots of people gathering data,
Uh-huh.
but the sort of the narrative that they were sort of charged with investigating sort of set the tone for what they found. And ultimately, the Dillingham Commission's findings were used to justify the use of a racial quota system in immigration.
Did they
Um,
find that immigrants contribute to an increase in crime? Was that their finding?
I think so it's a lengthy report, and I
Yeah.
think what they were looking at were questions of, were immigrants more likely to be involved in criminal activity? Were they more likely to use welfare, et cetera, et cetera? And of course, the way that the study was done sort of presupposed many of the answers,
Exactly. Yeah.
right? They're looking for certain kinds of criminal behavior among certain populations, and they're able to find it. And so I think the kind of the social scientific soundness of findings that immigrants commit crime, as interpreted through the eyes of the Dillingham Commission, are quite questionable given the sort of eugenics lens from which they started, right?
Yeah.
And that sort of brings, I think, us to think bigger questions about how we define crime and when we worry about crime and what kinds of crimes we worry about. And I think there again, you can see the way that, certain kinds of drug use gets penalized differently from other kinds of drug use. Certain kinds of people get policed differently from other kinds of people. And that was true, of course, in the era of the Dillingham Commission as it is today.
Today, yeah.
And so it just, when we sort of, when our question is, do they commit more crime? And we assume that crime is defined neutrally and criminal laws enforced neutrally, we've already missed part of the picture, right? We have to ask not just, do people commit more crimes, but also what are we defining as crimes? Which conduct are we defining as crimes? And who are we policing for that conduct? Is it kids on college campuses, or people living in impoverished neighborhoods, right?
Yeah.
And where we put police and how we police the conduct also determines crime rates. And that was true then, and it's true now. But it means that when you ask a question like, do immigrants commit more crimes? There are ways to look at that data and come to the answers that you want. And the Dillingham Commission was looking for particular kinds of answers in that regard.